4 warring factions, magic users destined for greatness, and a whole lot of pixely goodness. Hey there friends, it's Codiak here, welcome back to Legacy Gaming. Today, we're diving into Songs of Conquest, a new game by a small indie studio, Lavapotion, to find out if it's worth your time. Songs of Conquest is the first game ever released by the Swedish game studio Lavapotion. It's by no means a AAA operation, what with just 4 developers creating the game, but it's clear the team has a solid direction and great vision for the game, and spoiler, it's great. But before we get into all of that, let's dial it back. Songs of Conquest is a turn-based strategy game with some light RPG mechanics. The game is broken down into 3 sections: a campaign mode where the developers really stretch their storytelling muscles, a multiplayer mode that allows players to battle online or offline on pre-built or community-made maps, and the map editor, which was a really surprising feature we'll talk about in just a bit. The game, clearly inspired by the turn-based games of the 90s, does a fantastic job leaning into the things that made fans love the genre way back then, while still finding ways to modernize and strip out all the nonsense that sometimes weighs down games in this genre. If you have fond memories of playing Heroes of Might and Magic, you're going to be right at home in Songs of Conquest, as the parallels are clear. The campaign mode is really where Songs of Conquest is at its best. It's clear the developers put a lot of time and effort into making each beat of the story an experience, from the in-game text conversations that happen between major characters to the musical cutscenes that cut through the action at the end of every mission. What I truly appreciate about these missions, though, is the balance between storytelling and action. There's plenty of dialogue to help establish the world, the 4 major factions, and some of the major characters, but a majority of the time, you're running around the map collecting resources and trying to tip the scales of power your way. During each mission, you control a wielder, or sometimes multiple wielders. These are magic users that command the troops on the battlefield, but also have access to a range of magical abilities. Majority of the time, you're moving your wielder around the map, picking up resources, tapping into sources of power, and looking for every opportunity to expand your passive incomes. The more you collect, the more buying power you have when building up your different settlements. While not complex, the base building aspect of the game is rather important. Depending on the size of your base, you'll have access to small, medium, and large plots of land, which you can use to place buildings. These buildings do a variety of things, such as increase your income of a particular resource, generate troops to be recruited every turn, or act as a research hub. It's not an expansive list, but enough to provide variety to the player, and more importantly, flexibility. Each of the 4 factions that will launch at early access play differently, and while there are only 2 major campaigns at the time of making this video, you can check out all 4 of the factions in custom games and get a feel for their nuances. Now, all this work is of course to prepare us for combat. Before jumping into a battle, however, you have the option to reposition your troops, as well as decide if you want to fight the battle manually or let the computer do the fighting for you. I found you had to be careful with automatic fights, as I would occasionally lose even when the matchup was a clear slam dunk. It was frustrating, but luckily the game's very generous autosave feature allowed me to dial back my progression just a few minutes beforehand and avoid derailing my entire playthrough. Jumping into combat, things are smooth and snappy, and I really appreciate that. Even large battles with many troops seem to move quickly because there really isn't a lot slowing it down. Troop actions are determined by a stat called Initiative, and apart from the occasional special ability or wielder spell, you're in and out of a conflict in just a few minutes. I have to say, this is actually one of the biggest selling points as far as the combat is concerned. I never felt like the game was trying to artificially extend the action, something that often happens in other games of this genre. The wielder magic is also a great touch. Based on a number of factors, you'll accumulate different resources, giving you access to different spells throughout each fight. These add a nice layer to each encounter and provide you with another tool you can use to fight off the enemy. Now, the magic isn't just a nice feature, it's pretty much essential, as the learning curve can often catch you off guard. It's actually one of my biggest complaints with the game, but even then, it's really not a deal breaker. The difficulty is just inconsistent. Sometimes you'll roll through a campaign mission, no problem. Other times, you'll barely get off the starting blocks. I like to think it's a puzzle, one cleverly designed by the developers to force the player to think about every action they take, but I think that's a bit naive. I do appreciate a good challenge, but when the pendulum swings so drastically from moment to moment, it's pretty clear it's a balancing issue. All that aside, I think you have a pretty decent snapshot of the game at this point. So let's drill down and talk about some of the things that really stand out. Songs of Conquest caught me by surprise, I'm not gonna lie. When the developers first reached out to see if I was even interested in a key, I just kind of pushed that email off, but when I came back to it and really looked at what the team had created, I was sold. The first thing that really surprised me was the higher fidelity pixel art style. I don't know if it's 32-bit, 64, 128, whatever, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that everything looks great and harkens back to those 90s inspirations, while still managing to look and feel modern. The genre as a whole has touted fidelity as a selling point, but in this case, the pixel style works so much better because it allows other elements of the game to shine through, mainly the story. I was really taken aback with how much dialogue was actually in the game, and while nothing is voice acted, I found that the writing was intriguing. It's a bit on the nose, but each faction isn't inherently good or evil. They each have their own agendas, and that comes across well in the story moments. I really hope the team considers putting some sort of voice acting to the game to bring these characters to life. I really think it could help tie together the overall presentation. But remember, this is just entering into early access. I mentioned it before, but I also want to talk about the pacing of the game, which I find fantastic. One thing that will inevitably lead me to turn off a game is too much dead weight, whether it be in the combat, storytelling, exploration, whatever. If there's too much dead weight holding back the game, it's an easy opportunity to give the player a reason to quit and go do something else. Whether intentionally or not, Lavapotion completely manages to subvert this trap by making the game incredibly nimble. It's easy to get into a match and the action picks up almost immediately, and that's a surefire way to hook players from the get-go. This ties pretty much into everything within the game, from the combat to the city building. It's not complex, which may disappoint a few people, but it's snappy and accessible, and that's great if the game hopes to attract newer players to the genre. Everything is easy to pick up, resources are straightforward and simple, building up a settlement gives you some options without getting obscure, and the combat is engaging without being laborious. All of the gears work in harmony together, which makes the action that much more enjoyable. There's one final thing we need to talk about when it comes to the good stuff within the game, and that's the map editor. Right out of the gate, on day one of early access, Songs of Conquest will have an integrated map-making tool, something the community can use to create custom experiences. Talk about a smart play. This screams longevity for the game, even if the community ends up being small. Giving players the tools to create their own experience is always a good choice when it's a viable option. Now, I'm no map maker by any stretch, but just noodling around with the tool, I could see the potential for players far more creative than myself. It honestly reminded me of the map editor from Warcraft 3 and the custom games that literally transformed the industry because of that one tool. I don't think this map editor will reach that level of notoriety, but it's an awesome feature and something I think the community will really enjoy. Now, the game isn't perfect, but for an early access title, it's well on its way to being a fully fleshed out experience. My biggest gripe, and I mentioned this before, is the difficulty balancing the moment-to-moment gameplay. I touched on the auto combat issue earlier as well, and I think it all somehow ties together. The game predicts how easy or hard an encounter is going to be, and that's the benchmark I used when deciding if I wanted to auto-engage or manually take on an encounter. Something is off here, plain and simple, and while a majority of the fights I took on seem to hit their mark, there are enough that don't that it's worth pointing out. This is clearly a balancing issue, something the team will obviously work on to perfect over the course of early access, but I can see it being a slight issue for more casual players that look to pick up the game. It's already a more accessible turn-based strategy game than others in the genre, so if the developers lean into that and blow the door wide open for new players to enjoy Songs of Conquest, I think they'll find success. In terms of other things that fall flat, I'll admit the list is kind of short, but there's one thing that comes to mind, and that's the occasional waiting period that sometimes occurs during a mission. Depending on how you fare in combat, there's a good chance you'll end up needing fresh troops to restore your armies. Well, unfortunately, depending on the mission, your options may be thin. There's always going to be an option, but sometimes things just don't happen in a few short turns. Depending on what buildings you have, you'll receive an income of troops every turn. If you have multiple wielders, those troops become a much more complicated, finite resource that you need to allocate across multiple armies. There's a good chance that your gold will far exceed how many troops you can actually buy, and what this boils down to is sitting around waiting for troops to roll in, as you snatch up anything that's available. Luckily, the game does have built-in difficulty scaling, but it's not a fun experience waiting for enough troops to funnel in before you can get back into the action. I wish I could see a clear solution to this issue, but in most cases, this problem is going to depend on a number of factors: how good you are at combat, how many settlements are available on a map, and what challenges bar your path. Songs of Conquest is well on its way to making a name for itself in 2022. The game is just hitting early access, and the developers have put together a fantastic showing of what the game is capable of. It's clearly not all there, but with 2 campaigns for players to sink their teeth into, the endless enjoyment of custom games both local and online, as well as access to a map editor, it's pretty clear that Songs of Conquest has all the showings of a successful title. What I love about the game is its accessibility and its ability to hook you in within just a few short minutes. That's always an important factor when name ID isn't enough to sell copies of your game. Once you're in, you realize Lavapotion has really come up with some interesting concepts like the magic-using wielder, the clever city building, and the overall aesthetic of the world and the game. This all works in favor of the title. Songs of Conquest isn't perfect, not yet, but for an early access title, it doesn't need to be. What it's showcasing is fantastic, and whether you're new to the turn-based strategy genre or someone that first picked up Heroes of Might and Magic back in the 90s, there's no doubt that Songs of Conquest has a little something for everyone. It gets the stamp of approval from the Legacy team, and absolutely worth your time. Songs of Conquest hits early access for PC on May 10th, and as with most early access titles, it's most likely going to start at a relatively low price tag, but creep up as development continues. Remember, this isn't some massive AAA studio, it's a team of 4 putting out their first game, so if what we've showed you has enticed you in any way, shape, or form, throw some support behind these guys and encourage them to keep going. The game is in great shape, and after about 10 hours with the title, I can easily say it is an enjoyable experience from start to finish. If you did find this worth your time review helpful, do me a solid and hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing. There are so many big games left to come in 2022, and if you're looking for new takes on some of the year's biggest titles, we've got you covered. We also invite you to join us on Discord. We've got a great group of around 20,000 members, so if you're looking for a new community to interact with, check out the link in the description below. Finally, if you like everything we're doing here at Legacy Gaming and you want to support us even more, you can do so by becoming a member. For just a couple bucks, you're helping evolve the channel and take our community to that next level. Check out the join button below to learn more. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.